Hi everyone, welcome to the Neuromuscular Junction with Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky. Today we're going to talk about glycogen storage disease. Glycogen storage disease essentially is a problem where our glycogen, which is a form of starch, gets stuck inside our muscle and we can't break it down for energy when we're doing exercise. There are a variety of different strategies that one can use to actually be able to exercise with this disorder. We're going to talk about that later in this video. So glycogen storage disease is a disorder where glycogen ends up stuck in different tissues. What we're interested in and what we're going to discuss in this video are the ones that affect skeletal muscle. And they lead to muscle cramps with exercise, and people can actually break down their muscle, called rhabdomyolysis, if they push too hard. So let's first get into how these things happen. What's the biochemistry behind this? So when we eat, sugar comes into our muscles and it's stored as glycogen, which is a form of starch inside our muscle. When we exercise, we need energy. So the first thing that happens in our muscles when we start to go for a run, we get up and start going up a flight of stairs, for example, is our muscles need energy. The immediate energy currency is called ATP. Problem is that we can't store ATP in our muscles. So when we exercise, within a fraction of a second, the ATP immediately drops and we have to replenish it. The first thing that we can do to replenish our ATP is we use what's called phosphocreatine. So creatine is something that we get in fish and meat, and it's something that the body makes every day. In fact, muscle is the largest store of creatine in the entire human body. And what happens when you have creatine inside your muscle is we get a thing called a phosphate group stuck on it, so that when ATP drops, that phosphate can go and replenish ATP. We have stores in our muscle of creatine that last for anywhere from 8 to 10 seconds of contraction, but eventually that phosphocreatine will drop as well. Now, the muscles have another storage, which is the main storage of energy, which is glycogen. And what happens is even within 2 seconds of contraction, we know that it's possible we're going to run out of phosphocreatine, so we need more energy. And what happens is we immediately start to break down glycogen within muscle. The glycogen, which really is just a bunch of sugar stuck together, is broken down by a series of enzymes, and then it goes through a pathway called glycolysis. And the muscle glycogen storage diseases can either affect the breakdown of glycogen, called glycogenolysis, or splitting of glycogen, or the flux of glucose, the sugar that comes off of that, through this pathway called glycolysis. And there's a whole series of enzymes that are needed. And if there's a genetic disease that affects them, that can end up causing problems because you just can't use the energy when you need it. Why that's a problem is that, let's say you're going to be running 100 meters, you're going up and down a flight of stairs several times, and you run out of your phosphocreatine in a few seconds, and if you can't get that glycogen breakdown, the muscle ends up in an energy crisis. What happens then is that if our ATP levels stay low, we have damage to the muscle membrane, which leads to a release of a variety of proteins that are inside the muscle. Some of these proteins actually define the breakdown of muscle, called rhabdomyolysis, such as creatine kinase. That was an enzyme that's involved in that creatine phosphocreatine that we talked about. But when the muscle breaks open, creatine kinase leaks out, and if it goes to more than 10 times the upper limit of normal, that means there's muscle breakdown or rhabdomyolysis. Many of you who have this disorder probably didn't know that you had the disease. For years and years when you were young, you just knew that when you exercised, after a few minutes, even a few seconds in some cases, people would get muscle cramps, and usually the next day you would see a dark urine. We call that pigmenturia or myoglobinuria because it's the myoglobin which can damage the kidneys. Why that's a problem is not only is it uncomfortable and your muscles are sore for several days, but when you see that dark color, there can be damage to the kidneys. So anyone who's watching this video, in spite of all of our advice, if you still get rhabdomyolysis, make sure you seek medical attention and make sure you drink a lot to help keep those kidneys flushed out. So for most people, they were not good athletes. They were excluded from sports. They were the last kid in the 100-meter sprint at school. So many people with glycogen storage disease stop exercising. It's well known now that exercise can be very helpful for individuals. And what exercise does, if done carefully, is it slowly increases the threshold for symptoms so that just doing daily activities doesn't precipitate your symptoms. So let's talk about the two main types of glycogen storage disease. The main disorder which affects the breakdown of glycogen is called McArdle disease or glycogen storage disease type 5. That is an autosomal recessive disorder, which means you get a bad copy of the gene from your mom and dad, and the enzyme usually is functioning at less than 5% of its activity. Therefore, you can't break down glycogen. The main glycolytic defect, where you can't break down the sugar, is PFK deficiency, otherwise known as glycogen storage disease type 7 or Tarnopolsky disease. So there's a variety of other enzymes involved in the glycolytic pathway, which are more rare, but whatever we say about Tarnopolsky disease, pretty much the same thing is true for all of those disorders. So if you have one of them, follow the advice for Tarnopolsky disease. The other disorder involved in breaking down glycogen is called phosphorylase B kinase, which is the activator of phosphorylase, or the activator of the enzyme in McArdle disease. So what happens with exercise? How can we avoid running into problems? So the first thing, which most of you have probably experienced, is that when you start exercising, very rapidly, within seconds to a minute, your muscles will be stiff and they will go into a cramp. If you ease off, usually the cramp will alleviate itself, and if you ease back into exercise after a few minutes, you will feel that it's much easier. You almost feel like the blood is rushing into the muscle, and your heart rate, your breathing rate will come down. That's called the second wind phenomenon. How this happens is that we have different substrates. Sugar coming in from the blood, fats and proteins can come into the muscle and be utilized for energy, and that's what we call the second wind. So one of the ways to get into the second wind is to listen to your body, start off very, very slow, take a good, long, slow warm-up, ease off if your muscles are getting tight, and then gradually go back into it to get into second wind. And most of you have probably just adapted your lifestyle to get into the second wind. The other thing that's very interesting, and this is only for the glycogenolytic defects, is to have a little bit of sugar within 10 or 15 minutes before exercise. Now, to most of you, that seems illogical. Why would you take sugar if you've got a glycogen storage disease? Now, if you take sugar and you're exercising within 10 to 15 minutes, that glucose from the sugars can come in, and it can be utilized through the glycolysis without going up to make the starch and getting stuck. So that can help people to get into a second wind, and my colleague Ron Haller was the first to really show the benefits of this in people who have McArdle disease, and that's a very established therapy. So things like Gatorade, fruit juice, some people just have a piece of fruit beforehand, something that's got a lot of what we call simple sugars, but again, it has to be 10 to 15 minutes before exercise, not an hour before. If you take it an hour before, your insulin's going to go up and it's going to be stuck as glycogen, and you won't be able to access it if you've got that metabolic block. Now, that is not the case for PFK deficiency. And in fact, if you give sugar before exercise in PFK deficiency or any of the glycolytic defects, what happens is when the insulin goes up, it blocks the ability to liberate free fatty acids and amino acids, which you're using for energy. And so it actually makes the disease worse, because you can't take advantage of that sugar anyhow because it's blocked when it comes into the muscle. And all it does is inhibit your ability to utilize the free fatty acids and the amino acids. So in contrast to taking sugar right before exercise, in Tarnopolsky disease and glycolytic defects, we want to be fasted. So we have one fellow in particular who's been very successful at weight training and exercising with Tarnopolsky disease. And what he does is fast overnight, goes to the gym after just a bit of coffee or water, again, no sugar in that coffee, and the body being fasted overnight, there'll be higher free fatty acids and also amino acids like leucine, which the cell can use for energy. And he can usually do an hour of aerobic exercise, even with some weights as well, without problems if he fasts. When you finish, then you can go and get something to eat, which is really the opposite of McArdle disease. The other trick when you're exercising with either Tarnopolsky disease or McArdle disease is don't stress that system. So for most muscular dystrophies, we say that people should do 3 sets of 12 to 15 repetitions. But by the time you got to 12 repetitions, you're going to be really taxing the glycolytic and glycogenolytic pathways. So generally, if you're going to be doing any weight training, do anywhere from 7 to 8 repetitions and no more. But everyone, listen to your body. If 6 repetitions you start to feel a tightening, just stick with 6 repetitions. Always give the muscle at least 2 to 3 minutes to recover. So if you're doing a set with one arm, give yourself 2 to 3 minutes before you go back to that same arm. Now, if you don't understand the terms like reps and sets, please go to our video on coming to terms with terms so you can better understand those when you're exercising. So with those tips with exercise and diet, hopefully this can help you to achieve your exercise goals. Other things that people may want to consider are a high protein diet. So if you have a fairly high protein diet, you can use some of those amino acids both for endurance exercise and also for muscle building. So we would usually recommend 1.4, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. There's also something called ketone bodies, and there's more research to come in this area, but there's a number of individuals who are going on a higher fat diet to increase their ketones. There are issues with that, both from a compliance perspective and the long-term consequences in terms of fatty liver disease and other things are still a little bit unknown. But there are ketone salts that are becoming more and more available. People can get the various ketone salts that you can get in a drink. A whole bunch of them are now available. They're not very tasty, but people are using food science to make these more and more tasty. And hopefully over the next few years, we'll learn more about how these can help you to improve your exercise capacity. For those of you on a ketogenic diet, make sure you're being followed by a doctor to get your liver function checked and make sure that you have no other health issues like pancreatitis and other things which are rare side effects that you could encounter. So hopefully with this advice, you'll enjoy your exercise and get more fit and improve your functional capacity. So I do hope that you've learned some valuable tips for exercise and nutrition regarding glycogen storage disease. Please subscribe to our channel. Click the bell if you want to be informed about this and other areas of interest that you might have related to exercise and muscle disease. And please leave some suggestions in the comments section of our channel. Thanks.